Make no mistake about it, we are at war. As I record these words on Sunday, March 1st, 2026, American military operations in Iran continue. Iranian missiles are striking American bases across the Middle East, as well as cities like Dubai. The supreme leader of Iran is dead, killed by an Israeli airstrike with American support. And the President of the United States has called for regime change, the very policy he spent a decade promising to reject. By the time you hear this episode on Tuesday, the situation will have evolved, perhaps dramatically. I cannot know what headlines you are waking up to. I cannot know whether escalation has continued, whether American casualties have mounted, or whether the region has descended further into chaos. But I will ask you to stay with me through this analysis regardless. Because what we examine today is not the news of the morning, it is the pattern of 80 years. The institutions that made this war possible, the promises that were broken to deliver it, and the trajectory that leads from the National Security Act of 1947 to Operation Epic Fury in 2026.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
What happened on February 28th? Approximately 1 a.m. Eastern Time, the United States military began what President Trump called major combat operations in Iran. In an 8-minute video posted to Truth Social at 2:30 a.m., not a primetime address, not a speech to Congress, the president announced that America's objective was to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime. The operation, codenamed Epic Fury by the Pentagon and Roaring Lion by Israel, struck targets across Iran: Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, Karaj, Kermanshah, the port city of Bushehr, military installations, leadership compounds, and according to Iranian authorities, a primary school in the coastal city of Manab. I must pause here to address something we have learned through decades of conflict. In the early hours and days of any war, propaganda flows from all sides. We saw this in Ukraine, the Ghost of Kiev, the Snake Island Last Stand. Stories that captured imaginations but later proved exaggerated or false. We saw this in Gaza, claims and counterclaims about hospitals, about casualties, about responsibility. The fog of war is not merely confusion. It is often deliberate. The Iranian government claims over 200 dead, including more than 100 school children in Manab. The Iranian Red Crescent reports 747 injured. These numbers may prove accurate, they may prove inflated, or they may prove understated. I report them because they are claims being made. I do not report them as verified fact. What is beyond dispute is that American bombs are falling on Iran. Iranian missiles are striking American positions, and people are dying on both sides. What we can examine with clarity is this. No declaration of war was sought from Congress. No vote was taken. The Gang of Eight, the 8 congressional leaders briefed on classified intelligence, was informed before the strikes. But the representatives of the American people, the American public, who overwhelmingly oppose a regime change war, those representatives were not asked to authorize this war. In fact, the Massey-Connor resolution, H.R. 38, which would have required congressional authorization before strikes on Iran, was never brought to a vote. I would argue that that resolution was redundant because the Constitution already prohibits that. But yet again, the constitutional process was bypassed entirely. This was not an aberration. This is a pattern. This is what the national security state was designed to enable. Today, we examine how we arrived at this moment, not through the lens of breaking news, but through the lens of institutional history. How the war on terror framework made this war possible. How campaign promises transform into their opposites. How the institutions capture every president, Republican or Democrat, who promises to restrain them. Stay with me. The headlines will change. The pattern will not. And I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 8B of the series, Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements, from the Founders to the Forever Wars. Today, the institutions deliver, from the War on Terror to Operation Epic Fury. This is a contemporary application episode corresponding to episode 8 on the national security state, which we released on Saturday. In that episode, we examined how the institutions of permanent war were constructed after World War II. The CIA, the National Security Council, the Pentagon, NATO, and the Korean War precedent that destroyed congressional war power. Today, we examine what those institutions have delivered, how they survived the Soviet collapse, how they found new life in the war on terror, and how, in February 2026, they produced the very outcome the old right warned against. And the very outcome Donald Trump himself spent a decade promising to prevent. Let us begin.
Our president will start a war with Iran because he has absolutely no ability to negotiate. He's weak and he's ineffective. So the only way he figures that he's going to get reelected, and as sure as you're sitting there, is to start a war with Iran.
The war in Iraq was a big, fat mistake, all right? Now, you can take it any way you want, and it took Jeb Bush, if you remember at the beginning of his announcement, when he announced for president, took him 5 days. He went back. It was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. Took him 5 days before his people told him what to say, and he ultimately said it was a mistake. The war in Iraq, we spent $2 trillion, thousands of lives. We don't even have it. Iran is taking over Iraq with the second largest oil reserves in the world. Obviously, it was a mistake. So George Bush made a mistake. We can make mistakes, but that one was a beauty. We should have never been in Iraq. We have destabilized the Middle East.
But so you still think he should be impeached?
I think it's my turn, isn't it?
You do whatever you want. You call it whatever you want. I want to tell you, they lied.
Okay.
They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none, and they knew there were none. There were no weapons of mass destruction.
These globalists want to squander all of America's strength, blood, and treasure, chasing monsters and phantoms overseas. In addition, there must also be a complete commitment to dismantling the entire globalist neocon establishment that is perpetually dragging us into endless wars, pretending to fight for freedom and democracy abroad.
We should have never gone into the Middle East. We should have never gone into the Middle East. Under my leadership, we will turn the page forever on those foolish, stupid days of never-ending wars.
We're rebuilding our military stronger than ever before, and we are not going to deplete it again on stupid, senseless, endless wars. World War III has never been closer than it is right now. We need to clean house of all of the warmongers and America last globalists and the deep state. I am the president who delivers peace.
I was the first president in decades who didn't start a war.
And the worst, most incompetent, most corrupt president in history is going to drag us into World War III.
And this horrible, horrible president is dragging us toward World War III. We're going to be in World War III soon.
Because I think we would have been good with Iran. I don't want to do anything bad to Iran.
These clips were not offhand remarks. They were the pillars of political identity. Donald Trump built his foreign policy brand on rejecting the interventionism of his predecessors. He attacked George W. Bush for Iraq. He attacked Barack Obama for Libya. He attacked Hillary Clinton for her vote authorizing the Iraq War. And it was not only Trump. Listen to his Vice President, J.D. Vance, writing in the Wall Street Journal in January of 2023. In Mr. Trump's 4 years in office, he started no wars despite enormous pressure from his own party and even members of his own administration. Not starting wars is perhaps a low bar, but that's a reflection on the hawkishness of Mr. Trump's predecessors and the foreign policy establishment they slavishly followed. Vance built his political identity on this foundation. In March 2023, on the 20th anniversary of the Iraq invasion, he posted, "The war killed many innocent Iraqis and Americans. It destroyed the oldest Christian populations in the world. It cost over $1 trillion. It turned Iraq into a satellite of Iran. It was an unforced disaster, and I pray that we learn its lessons." And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, in December of 2025, just a couple of months ago, just 2 months before these strikes on Iran, the Department of Defense will not be distracted by democracy-building interventionism, undefined wars, regime change. And yet, on February 28th, 2026, 2:30 a.m. Eastern Time, a short time ago, the United States military began major combat operations in Iran. Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime, a vicious group of very hard, terrible people. That was President Trump. And later that same day on social media, President Trump continued, "If the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be a regime change?" MIGA. M-I-G-A. The man who accused Obama of wanting to attack Iran to look tough is now attacking Iran. The man who called regime change a failed policy is now pursuing regime change. The administration that promised to reject undefined wars has begun an undefined war. The music in the background. The question Ives poses in the music, the trumpet's query that the strings can never answer, is the question at the heart of American foreign policy. How does this keep happening? How do the promises of restraint transform into the reality of intervention? How does every president who campaigns against war become a war president? The answer is not hypocrisy, though hypocrisy plays its part. The answer is not conspiracy, though interests align in convenient ways. And the answer is not Team Red versus Team Blue, the Republicans versus the Democrats, my guy is better than your guy. No. The answer is institutional. The national security state is stronger than any president's campaign promises. The machinery of empire captures everyone who enters the White House. The institutions built in 1947, expanded after September 11th, perfected through 2 decades of war on terror. These institutions deliver war because that is what they were designed to do.
I warned against entangling alliances. They did not listen. Now you can trace exactly how it happened.
The Consequential Actions podcast is on YouTube. Subscribe and follow each series from the very beginning. Principled debate requires participation. Like the episodes. Leave a comment. Join the discussion.
Every series is organized as a playlist, from General Welfare to The New Leviathan to Empire of Liberty. Begin at the beginning.
To understand how Operation Epic Fury became possible without congressional authorization, we must understand the legal and rhetorical framework that enabled it. That framework was constructed after September 11, 2001, and it was designed to enable precisely this outcome: presidential war-making without congressional constraint. The authorization for use of military force passed on September 14, 2001, contained 60 words that have justified 25 years of war. The president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons. Notice what the language does not contain. It does not name a country. It does not set a time limit. It does not define victory. It authorizes force against anyone the president determines was connected to September 11th, a determination made by the executive branch alone, without judicial review, without congressional oversight. Under this authorization, American forces have operated in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Niger, and dozens of other countries. Groups that did not exist on September 11, 2001 have been targeted under an authorization passed before they were founded against men who weren't even alive at that time. The logic is infinitely elastic. If a group is connected to a group that was connected to a group that was connected to Al-Qaeda, the AUMF applies. But Iran presents a particular challenge. Iran was not connected to September 11th. The hijackers were predominantly Saudi. The planning was Al-Qaeda's, a Sunni organization hostile to the Shia Iran. In fact, Al-Qaeda is championing this engagement, meaning Al-Qaeda is now on our side. The AUMF's logic, however strained, cannot reach Tehran. So the administration has employed different language. Listen carefully to President Trump's speech announcing the strikes. Iran is the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. State sponsor of terror. This designation, maintained by the State Department, carries legal consequences. It restricts trade, limits diplomatic engagement, and crucially, frames Iran not as a sovereign nation with which the United States might have disputes, but as a terrorist entity against which military action is inherently justified. Now, I've heard friends, colleagues, people just say matter-of-factly, of course, Iran is the #1 state sponsor of terror. It has been ingrained for over 20 years that this is true. Iran funds Hezbollah, Hamas. They are the #1 state sponsor of terror. That phrase, state sponsor of terror, listen to it closely. You'll hear people say it, your friends, your neighbors, because that is what's said over and over and over. And I'm not disputing the veracity that Iran does support terror. But that phrase, #1 state sponsor of terror, is very specific and very pointed for a reason. Now listen to the next phrase. Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime. This is also calculated. Imminent threats. This is the language of preemption. The doctrine that the United States may strike before an attack occurs, if an attack is believed to be imminent. But what does imminent mean in practice? In his State of the Union address on February 24th, just 4 days before these strikes, President Trump claimed Iran was rebuilding its nuclear program. Yet its own administration has repeatedly stated that the June 2025 strikes, 8 months earlier, Operation Midnight Hammer, had obliterated Iran's nuclear facilities. So which is true? Did Iran rebuild its entire nuclear facilities in 8 months? That seems unlikely. And if the program was obliterated, how could the threat be imminent? And if the threat was imminent, why had the administration spent months claiming victory? The answer, of course, is that imminent has been redefined to mean whatever the executive branch needs it to mean. As Scott Horton of antiwar.com observed in a recent interview with the American Conservative, from the Israeli point of view, enrichment at all is unacceptable. They'll sabotage facilities, murder scientists, and pressure the United States. The claims of a secret parallel weapons program could never be proven because it didn't exist. The pattern is identical to Iraq in 2003. The administration asserts a threat. Intelligence agencies express doubt. The war proceeds anyway. And the language, state sponsor of terror, imminent threat, weapons of mass destruction, provides the justification that congressional authorization would otherwise require. The Al Jazeera analysis comparing Trump's Iran policy to Bush's Iraq policy identified this pattern explicitly. The administration is updating the visual dictionary of fear. They are exaggerating the nuclear threat exactly as the Bush administration did with the smoking gun metaphor. But there is a key difference. In 2003, U.S. intelligence was manipulated to align with the lie. In 2026, the intelligence assessments actually contradict Trump's claims. The 2003 playbook required fabrication. The aluminum tubes, the yellow cake uranium, the mobile weapons labs. In 2026, the playbook requires only repetition. Say number one state sponsor of terror enough times, and the phrase becomes its own justification. Claim imminent threat often enough, and the claim becomes self-evident. This is what the War on Terror framework enables. Not a specific authorization for a specific action against a specific enemy, but a permanent state of emergency in which the president may wage war against any nation, organization, or person he deems a threat, without asking Congress, without presenting evidence, without constitutional process. NSC 68, the 1950 blueprint for Cold War militarization that we examined in Episode 8, declared that a defeat of free institutions anywhere is a defeat everywhere. That logic justified global intervention for 40 years. The War on Terror framework goes further. It does not merely justify intervention everywhere. It authorizes intervention by executive fiat, conducted in secret, accountable to no one. The founders placed the war power in Congress precisely because they understood that executives are most interested in war, most prone to it, as Madison wrote. The War on Terror framework has delivered what Madison feared, an executive branch that wages war as it pleases, constrained only by its own discretion. Now, I am critical in this piece of President Trump because he is the executive in office right now. I am under no illusion that this is a Republican, Trumpian, partisan act in any way. If the past 25 years have proven anything, it is that war is bipartisan. Interventionism is bipartisan. It is not the purview of one single politician. What we're seeing is that politicians that campaigned against it, in fact, have been turned. Obama won a Nobel Peace Prize when he first came into office. He campaigned on peace. He persecuted several wars: Libya, Syria, Yemen, Somalia. He kept the war going in Iraq and Afghanistan. President Trump campaigned as the next peace president to deliver on the promises that Obama failed to. He again continued the wars. In his first term, as he says, he didn't start any new wars, except for that bombing in Somalia, which continued. And then in his second term, we have come to this point. This is not a slam against President Donald Trump because he's President Trump. It is a critique of all administrations. And I will source several sites in here, including leftist sites or purported leftist sites such as the Washington Post or Al Jazeera, because it is easier for those sites to speak out against President Trump due to the partisanship. They can get away with it. They were less critical of Obama and Biden during their persecutions of war. But nonetheless, we see the same pattern continuing. So if you are listening and you are cheering this in any fashion, which is unfathomable to me, because I'm critical of President Trump, please understand, I'm critical of President Biden, President Obama, Vice President Kamala Harris, as what she would have done in this position, and all other politicians, save for the ones that have demonstrated time after time after time that they are against intervention. And there is a moment in every presidency when the campaign promises collide with institutional pressures and the promises lose. For George W. Bush, that moment came on September 11, 2001, but the transformation was already prepared. During the 2000 campaign, Bush has explicitly rejected nation building. This was his quote: "I don't think our troops ought to be used for what's called nation building." He criticized the Clinton administration's interventions in Somalia, Haiti, and the Balkans. He promised a humble foreign policy. And then within 2 years, he had launched the most ambitious nation-building project since the Marshall Plan, the reconstruction of Iraq. The neoconservatives who surrounded Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Pearl, had advocated regime change in Iraq throughout the 1990s. They were in the administration waiting. When the opportunity arose, they seized it. And the president who campaigned against nation building became the president who attempted to rebuild the entire Middle East. Donald Trump studied this history. He invoked it constantly. His critique of Bush was central to his political identity. In May of 2025, President Trump gave one of the best non-interventionist speeches in modern political history by a president. He says, "The gleaming marvels of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi were not created by the so-called nation builders, neocons, or liberal nonprofits, like those who spent trillions failing to develop Kabul and Baghdad and so many other cities. In the end, the so-called nation builders wrecked far more nations than they built, and the interventionists were intervening in complex societies that did not even understand themselves." That was an amazing quote. And it's not ancient history. This was his speech just 9 months ago. The rejection of nation building, of neoconservatism, of interventionism. This was not a position he had abandoned years earlier. This was a position he held while the planning on the strikes on Iran were happening. The CNN analysis published on February 28th documented this contradiction with precision. He said toppling regimes without sufficient plans creates power vacuums that are filled simply by terrorists. He said he would break the cycle of regime change and abandon the policy of reckless regime change favored by my opponent. And yet, by his own account, the goal of Operation Epic Fury is regime change. In his announcement video, Trump addressed the Iranian people directly. To the great, proud people of Iran, take over your government. This will probably be your only chance for generations. The Washington Post analysis asked the obvious question: how did we get here? President George W. Bush's misguided invasion of Iraq in 2003 changed the trajectory of American politics in ways few could have foreseen at the time. The Iraq War produced Barack Obama, who campaigned on opposition to that war. It produced Donald Trump, who attacked both parties for supporting it. The lesson seemed clear. The American people had rejected regime change, and politicians who wanted to win elections needed to reject it too. But Barack Obama continued to persecute the Iraq War. And now Donald Trump has led us into war with Iran. Consider the figures who surround Trump in his second term. Many campaigned on restraint. J.D. Vance built his Senate campaign on opposing aid to Ukraine and rejecting interventionism. Pete Hegseth wrote books criticizing the military establishment. They were, by their own account, the antidote to the neoconservatives who captured the Bush administration. And yet, here we are. The same outcome, the same trajectory, the same transformation of campaign promises into regime change. The Chatham House analysis published within hours of the strikes identified what this means. The parallel with 2003 Iraq War is difficult to ignore. That war demonstrated that collapsing or attempting to collapse a regime is far easier than shaping what follows. The analysis continued. This has the makings of the kind of enduring conflict that Trump said he did not want. Even if Khomeini went, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps are a real military-industrial complex running much of the economy, and one of them could end up in charge. The intelligence community reportedly assessed before the strikes began that Khomeini's likely successors would be hardline leaders from the IRGC, the very organization responsible for Iran's nuclear and missile programs, the very people Trump claims to be targeting. If this assessment is accurate, the strikes may produce not the liberal democracy that Trump envisions, but a more radical, more militarized regime, exactly as the Iraq War produced Iranian influence across the region, exactly as the Libya intervention produced a failed state, exactly as every regime change operation has produced unintended consequences worse than the original problem. Why does this keep happening? The Council on Foreign Relations analysis offered one answer. There are good reasons why previous presidents were reluctant to become embroiled in a war with Iran. Trump has ignored all the caveats. Now he will have to deal with the fallout from the biggest gamble of his presidency. But this analysis misses the deeper pattern. Previous presidents were not more cautious because they were wiser. They were constrained by different circumstances. The institutions pressed for war with Iran under Bush, under Obama, under Biden. The pressure was constant. What changed was not the institution's desire for war, but the opportunity to wage it. The protests in Iran in late 2025 and early 2026 provided that opportunity. Per reports, tens of thousands dead, according to various estimates. The regime was weakened. The population restive. The moment seemed right. But the institutions did not create this opportunity in order to help the Iranian people. The institutions seized this opportunity because they had been waiting for decades. The war they wanted in 2007, in 2012, in 2019, the war that Bush avoided, that Obama sidestepped, that Biden postponed, this war was always coming. It was only a matter of when. The transformation of campaign promises is not a failure of individual character. It's a feature of institutional design. The national security state selects for war. It promotes officials who advocate for war. It sidelines any officials who counsel restraint. It presents presidents with options that all lead to war. And when the war comes, it claims to be merely executing the president's decision, when in fact, it has shaped every decision the president was allowed to make. I'll state that again. The national security state selects for war. The officers, advisors to the president, to the administration, are those that are hawkish. If you are dovish at all, if you promote restraint or prudence, you are sidelined in that hierarchy. And so when a president takes office and listens to his advisors are preparing him for the only answer that he is allowed to make, which is for war. We are not in that briefing room. We are not listening to those advisors. We are not the President of the United States. We have the opportunity to look at things from a different perspective. We have the opportunity to understand what the founders did, that by pushing the executive into that position, that allows for these types of outcomes. Instead, we should be advocating to counsel restraint, to put these decisions in the hands of the representatives to make a deliberative decision, weighing all options, weighing the will of the people, not just the decisions of one man. Now, if the war on terror were truly about terrorism, it would have ended long ago. Al-Qaeda is a shadow of its former self. ISIS's territorial caliphate was destroyed years ago. The specific threat that justified the AUMF in 2001 has been, by any reasonable measure, addressed. But the war on terror was never only about terrorism. It was about methodology. It was about legal framework. It was about the capacity for executive action unconstrained by constitutional process. And that methodology is now being applied globally to Iran, to Venezuela, to Mexico, to any organization or nation that falls within the expansive definition of threat. Consider what happened in Mexico just 1 week before the Iran strikes. On February 22nd, 2026, Mexican security forces killed a Nemesio Asaguera Cervantes. Sure, I'm saying that name wrong, but he was known as El Mencho, the leader of the Jalisco New Generation cartel. The operation was successful in its immediate objective. But what followed? What followed was chaos. Over 70 dead, violence spreading across more than a dozen Mexican states, burned buses and roadblocks, hotels, gunmen in the streets of Guadalajara, a city that was scheduled to host the World Cup matches in June, and complete chaos in Puerto Vallarta. The United States played a central role. According to multiple reports, the CIA was instrumental in providing intelligence that led Mexican forces to El Mencho's location. A new joint interagency task force called Counter Cartel, based in Fort Huacha in Arizona, provided targeting information. The director of this task force, Brigadier General Mazurio Calabrese, described the mission in revealing terms. He compared his team's mission to the targeted killing campaigns previously waged against terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. This is not a war on drugs. This is the war on terror, rebranded and redirected. The same methodology, intelligence-driven targeting, decapitation strikes, the assumption that killing leaders will solve structural problems applied to a new enemy. The results in Mexico mirror the results everywhere this methodology has been deployed. Leaders are killed, organizations fracture, violence increases as factions compete for control. The underlying conditions: poverty, corruption, weak institutions, American demand for drugs, remain unchanged, and the cycle continues. The Intercept, in an article on February 23rd, noticed the grim familiarity. It has been almost 20 years since President Felipe Calderón's declared war on the cartels, a heavily militarized, U.S.-backed mission that has, despite endless arrests of high-level narcos, done virtually nothing to stem the flow of drugs into the U.S. The violence that followed El Mencho's death was fueled by American guns. The Fast and Furious program is cited as one of the ways in which these guns reached the Mexican cartels, and that was a program that apparently has been ongoing. Weapons flowed across the southern border as drugs flow north. The war that produced this violence is dictated by American policy, and the methodology that shapes this war is the methodology of the war on terror. Decapitation, targeted killing, the belief that eliminating individuals will transform systems. Venezuela provides another application. In recent weeks, the Trump administration captured Venezuela President Nicolas Maduro. We did a couple of episodes on this back in January, in what was described as a weekend military action. The details remain murky, but the pattern is clear. American military power deployed to remove foreign leaders without congressional authorization, without declarations of war, justified by executive determination of threat. And now, Iran, the largest application of all. A country of 95 million people, which is 3 times larger than what Iraq's population was in 2003, and an area that is 6 times larger than Iraq. Listen again to President Trump's stated objectives. As he said, "We are going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. We are going to annihilate their navy. We are going to ensure that the region's terrorist proxies can no longer destabilize the region. And we will ensure that Iran does not obtain a nuclear weapon." Again, I'm going to go back to the Council on Foreign Relations, and their analysis examined whether these objectives could be achieved. These are very ambitious objectives, and most of them cannot be achieved by air power alone. Destroying missiles and nuclear facilities is possible from the air. Destroying a navy is possible from the air, but ensuring that Iran no longer supports proxy groups, ensuring that a new government emerges that serves American interest, these objectives require what the administration claims to reject: occupation, nation building, and the long-term commitment of ground forces. The Chatham House analysis identified this gamble. The American strategy appears wholly predicated on the untested proposition that the Iranian people will quickly rise up. A huge gamble. Should a massive revolt fail to materialize, the Trump administration will face a fork in the road: fold or double down. This is the logic of regime change. This is what always requires. When air power fails to produce the desired political outcome, and it always fails, the choice becomes escalation or retreat. And the institutions do not counsel retreat. From Mexico to Venezuela to Iran, the pattern is consistent. The war on terror methodology, targeted killing, executive action, the assumption that force can transform politics, has become the default approach of American foreign policy. The specific enemy changes, the framework remains. The national security state does not require terrorism to justify its existence. It requires threats. And when old threats fade, new threats are identified. When old enemies are defeated, new enemies are designated. The machine requires fuel, and the world provides an endless supply. We return now to the foundations, to the constitutional design that was meant to prevent precisely this outcome, and to the warnings of those who saw this future clearly. In episode 8, we examined James Madison's argument for placing the war power in Congress. The executive is the department most interested in war, most prone to it. Say it with me. You guys know it by now. Madison, 1793. The founders understood that executives seek glory, that military victory enhances executive power, that the temptation to wage war is inherent in executive office. They placed the war power in Congress, the deliberative body, the representative body, the body that must face voters who bear the costs of war, precisely to constrain the executive ambition. The president has 2 terms. He's term limited. Especially in his second term, he is a lame duck. He does not face the voters again. Congress does. This design functioned imperfectly but meaningfully for over a century and a half. Presidents sought congressional authorization for major conflicts. The last formal declaration of war, though, came in 1942. But even without declarations, at least presidents generally sought authorization. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, the AUMF. But the War on Terror framework changed this. It did not merely expand executive war making, it normalized it. It created a permanent state of emergency in which executive action required no fresh authorization because the authorization of 2001 was deemed sufficient for any conflict the executive chose to pursue. It's how we bombed Somalia hundreds of times in a year. It's how we bomb fishing boats off the coast of Venezuela without any repercussion. Not even any serious repercussion from the press, who just go along with it. No due process, no trial showing the guilt of those killed on those boats. No clear answer for what we are doing in Somalia or why. Outside of the killing of potentially innocents or cause collateral damage, of which we know there always is, you have the lesser reality of the costs. Every missile, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. And no accountability from the press, no real accountability from the press. And no real accountability from the Congress or from the courts. Sure, a partisan Congress, when in power, will vote to impeach a president. We've seen that numbers of times. And typically, they're over offenses that are minor or unimpeachable offenses to begin with. But Congress will make a show of it. A kabuki theater. But the real items that are impeachable, the abdication of the Constitution itself, those measures that go in direct opposition to it, those are not brought up for impeachment because that would threaten the institution. That might bring accountability back from the executive to the Congress. And now we've reached the end point. A major war against a sovereign nation, launched without congressional vote, announced via social media at 2:30 a.m. in the morning on a weekend. Representative Thomas Massie and Representative Ro Khanna had introduced H.R. 38, which would have required congressional authorization before the strikes on Iran. Again, I think that's a redundant measure because the Constitution already states clearly this. But nonetheless, the resolution had 76 Democratic co-sponsors. It had been introduced in June of 2025. It was ready for a vote. The vote never happened. the war began anyway. In Congress, the body constitutionally empowered to declare war, learned of the strikes the same way public did, from the social media account of the president. What does this mean for constitutional government? It means that congressional war power is dead. Not abolished by amendment, not overturned by court decision, simply abandoned through disuse, ignored through precedent, rendered meaningless by institutional capture. The old right warned of this. Garrett, John T. Flynn, Robert Taft, they saw where national security state would lead. Ron Paul spoke about this at length, over and over again to anyone that would listen. In episode 7, we examined how their warnings were dismissed, how they were called isolationist and worse. But their predictions have been vindicated by 80 years of history. Emergency powers become permanent. Military budgets never return to pre-war levels. Constitutional limits erode one precedent at a time. And the machinery of war, once constructed, finds new enemies to justify its continuation. Eisenhower's warning, delivered as he left office in 1961 after spending 8 years building the very thing he warned against, captures this tragedy. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. The influence is no longer unwarranted. It has been ratified by decades of practice. The misplaced power has risen and persisted. And the alert and knowledgeable citizenry that Eisenhower said could compel the proper meshing of our huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, that citizenry was never given the chance to compel anything. The war in Iran was decided by the executive branch. The citizens learned of it after the bombs began falling. Before we close, I must address something unusual about the timing of this episode. When we planned this series months ago, mapping out 20 episodes, examining Americans' foreign entanglements from the founders to the present, we scheduled our examination of the 1953 Iranian coup for this very week. Article 9, titled Kermit's Game, was always planned for release on Sunday, March 2nd. Episode 9 was always scheduled to examine how the institutions built in 1947 were first deployed. We could not have known then that as you listen to this episode, American bombs would be falling on Tehran. But the coincidence, if you call it a coincidence, illuminates this arc that we are tracing. On Sunday, our article examined how the CIA, barely 6 years old, orchestrated the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran. How Mossadegh's nationalization of Iranian oil threatened British interests. How the CIA's Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of Teddy, engineered the coup that installed Mohammad Reza Shah. How the Shah's authoritarian rule, his secret police, his suppression of dissent, created the condition for the 1979 revolution. And how that revolution produced the Islamic Republic, and how that republic is now at war with the nation that created the conditions for its existence. 73 years from the institutions built to their first deployment, to the consequences that shaped the Middle East, to the war now underway. This is not ancient history. This is a continuous thread. The national security state in action across generations. The coup of 1953 is not separate from the war of 2026. They are the same story told across 7 decades. I share this context not to excuse or to justify, but to illuminate. The war you are witnessing did not begin on February 28th, 2026. It began in 1947, when the institutions were built. It continued in 1953, when those institutions were first deployed against Iran, and it continued through the Shah's reign, through the revolution, through the hostage crisis, through decades of sanctions and threats and proxy conflicts. The institutions have delivered what they were designed to deliver. The machinery of empire has produced empire, and the constitutional republic the founders designed has been transformed into something that none of them would ever recognize. The institutions have delivered. The question is whether we will continue to accept that delivery. I encourage everyone interested in the full story to take a few minutes to read Article 9, Kermit's Dream, Iran, 1953, and the Template for Regime Change. And coming up on Saturday, Episode 9 will explore this history in depth, examining how the institutions built in 1947 were first deployed in Tehran, with consequences that echo to this very day. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been Episode 8, Part B of The Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements, from the Founders to the Forever Wars, on the Consequential Actions Podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you will find all of our written articles, as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause and the New Leviathan. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes. And follow me on X at @JKellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until then, have a great day.